Hello. My name is Mariah Young, and I'm writing faculty at Pima Community College. I really appreciate your question about what privileges we as educators have, and also how we became more aware of what privileges we have. And that's something that I was thinking about so much when I was in China. And I hope I can, like my presentation will help to fill out and maybe address some of those other questions that you had. So basically, just to kind of give an overview of what I'll talk about, being on this trip, it created a space for me to really re-recognize and affirm the vulnerability that a lot of my students have, not just in terms of being a student, but also how comfortable and how vulnerable they actually feel just being in an institution of higher learning. And I'll tell you a little bit about my students and how I came to recognize that. And it also really highlighted for me what power I have as a teacher in either affirming their right to be there, their belongingness, or undermining it. I expected to go to China and eat a lot of really good food and take a lot of cool pictures and see these beautiful sites and learn a lot. And I figured, yes, I'm going to take a lot of that curriculum back to share that with my students. What ended up happening is that I was forced to think about my fundamental role as a teacher and what power I have not only in the classroom, but how our institutions can really augment that sense of belonging to our students based on their cultures. And these experiences, these conversations that I had with not only our Chinese peers, the instructors that we had there, but also just our group of teachers, it really inspired me and enriched the curriculum that I took home to my students. And to kind of talk a little bit about something that Sandra has touched on, one of the most important things, or kind of like the bedrock for a lot of the realizations I had, was just remembering what it means to be a learner. So over here on the right, that's my Duolingo Mandarin notebook. I really got my teacher on. I was like, I'm going to China, man. I'm going to learn as much as I can. I read a bunch of books. I did Duolingo to what I thought was great success, of course. And we had our introductory language class, and I'm like, I'm ready, China. Bring it, I'm ready. And I perpetually embarrassed myself. These are two students who were very, very patient with me as I tried to ask them a very basic question. And I had so many experiences like this where I would try to talk to people, I would try to ask them things that I felt like, oh yeah, I've got the pronunciation right. And I was, of course, very wrong. And these were experiences where I was not just kind of embarrassing myself in front of these kids, native speakers, but I was also I was putting myself out there in front of my peers, right? In front of these other folks who are learning the language also. And what I really was thinking about is how just being in that state of learning, right? It's actually a really vulnerable state, right? You have to put yourself in this very kind of emotional space to learn a new language, but really also to try and enact it, and also enact it in front of others, in front of people that you want their respect, right? Whether it's your teacher or just your peers and your counterparts. And so this experience, it really made me go back into being in the shoes of my students. And I want to tell you a little bit about who my students are. So if you're not from Tucson, I teach at the Desert Vista campus of the community college. I teach in South Tucson. Most of my students are students of color. A lot of them are first generation. A lot of them come from Title I schools. A lot of them have very migratory backgrounds. They're first generation, second generation American. A lot of them are Native students. A lot of them are Latinx students. The migration and immigration are part of their stories. And sometimes that migration is by choice, and sometimes it's not. I have a lot of refugee students as well. So this is on the right, or on the left here, these are a graduating class of nursing students. And as you can see, I have a really diverse student body, but also a lot of them are older, a lot of them are non-traditional students. And over here on the right is the Learning Center, which I was managing, where we had to really actively convince students to come in to get the outside of class help that they needed. Because to ask for help is not part of their educational culture, their sense of culture. To ask for help or to try things and fail is huge. It's a sign of weakness. And so I was thinking so much about my students, and also how do I ensure that they have a space where they can get the support that they need, but also how am I in my institution creating a culture that they can be involved in? So over here on the right, this is a sign that we saw in a couple schools, which basically says, like, I'm not going to try to say it. I'll ask Grant to say it. He'll say it like immaculately. But see, it basically says, speak the standard language, 普通话, speak your standard language. Students in these Shanghai schools are discouraged from speaking their home language or their dialect. And it made me think about what is our 普通话, right? We have a 普通话in higher education, in any education system, and it's standard English, it's academic writing, it's academic language, but it's also how do you conduct yourself in class? What's the proper way to demonstrate your knowledge, right? For us, for that Western kind of Americanized education system, right? For those students who that's their default, that kind of white privileged default. It is being an active participant in class, right? Raise your hand, share your ideas, ask questions, ask tons of questions, be super involved. You're helping everyone else learn. For most of my students who are students of color, who come from communal backgrounds, who are not really sure that they even belong in school in the first place, that is not their culture. That is a learned culture, and one that they are not especially comfortable with, and not one that they feel natural in. And I was really thinking about how do I create a space in my classroom that can validate the kinds of culture that they are more fluent in, right? If you come from a more communal background, right? Or even if you're thinking about what obligations you have that are outside of the classroom, right? How can I legitimize that and validate that in the classroom? And so what I really, like, my big takeaway was the idea that globalizing my classroom isn't just about bringing in my experience from China, but how can I make it relevant and accessible and help augment the cultures that my students already have. My students are already global citizens. They are multicultural, they are multilingual, they code switch. They know how to go back and forth between these different cultures. But that is not something that generally is recognized as a skill. That is not something that is seen as important or relevant. If I can take the experiences that I had in China and say, here's how it mirrors your experiences. Here's how it maybe reflects or refracts some of the cultural issues or politics or these tensions that we think are kind of inborn or only I experience or only this one group experiences. How can that help them to re-see and rethink not only these issues, right, these topics, but where they live and how they thrive as global citizens, but also as students. How do they develop, right? So I want to show you a couple lessons that I developed with that in mind. So one thing one of the lessons that I developed was the idea of looking at physical borders. So we, of course, are a border city. We are 60 miles away from the U.S.-Mexico border. A lot of my students live in southern Arizona. They commute. They deal with ICE on a very regular basis. This border has a very specific meaning and context to them and to their families. So they are really fascinated by the idea of this recreated border wall from Beijing that was meant to divide the city into its different rungs, and that this is a tourist site. They were like, how is that even a tourist site? So we talk a bit about how these structures can come to take on different meanings, but also how history forces them to evolve and us to see these structures differently. And I show them pictures of me at the Great Wall of China, and also like these kind of different structures, and say how did these structures that were designed to keep people out or keep people in, how does that change? And what does that mean also for our own border? Are there possibilities in this changing? Can the semiotics of this border change? Another one in terms of that kind of the nationalist lexicon, right? Public art and public spaces. We talked a lot about statues. So I have a unit where we talk a bit about the rhetoric of spaces. And so I was able to show them these statues of scholars from the Confucian Temple. And I gave them a space to talk about why do we have these statues here? What do they represent? What do they say about the values of this culture? And what in turn can we infer when we think about our own commemorations? So we talk a bit about the Confederate monument controversies, but we talk about our own homegrown statue controversy. We have a statue of Pancho Villa in downtown Tucson that is perpetually trying. There's a certain segment of Tucson that wants to take that statue down. And so how do we look at these spaces in terms of what values they are highlighting? What do we want to preserve? What do we think should be revised or taken down? And what does that say about how our values change? I came up with a whole lot of other lessons about Gaokao, about the marriage market, but and as much as I like to dream that these all were mine alone, they absolutely were not. So much of these ideas came from this community of teachers. So we had our own Chinese peers. So this is on the left here is like the Graces. Big Grace, who is a writing instructor at the college in China where we were staying, and Little Grace, the most precocious and 7-year-old you will ever meet. She's 7 years old. She's smarter than I will ever be, and having conversations with the two of them made me think so much about what were my assumptions as a teacher. And you also don't know where your strengths are as a language teacher until you have to explain sarcasm to a 7-year-old in an age-appropriate way. And we, of course, got to dialogue with so many other instructors and teachers in China, but I got so many ideas and also refined so many ideas through our conversations, as Sandra was mentioning, right? Like so many of these ideas came from our interactions together. And one of my favorite lessons that came from just our conversations is an argument lesson. Like I teach writing, like kind of introductory writing. And so this was an argument that was ongoing in our trip about, is a Cheeto a chip? And I was able to kind of use artifacts from Chinese grocery stores to have students compare and contrast what makes a chip. All of my students, with the exception of my Filipino students, were not on board at all for shrimp chips. But it was a way for me to take this idea that could be very textbooky. This is a thesis. This is an argument, and make it more vibrant, more meaningful, and also so much more interactive. And I never would have put this together without being in this environment. And so, in terms of what I took away from this trip. I really reaffirmed my sense of the importance of being a learner to my strength as a teacher. I think every teacher should take a course or take a language, take something that is outside their area of expertise, because it's so important that we remember what it means to be a student. It's so easy for us to kind of dwell in like the house of our expertise. We forget that it takes so much strength for our students to come in and not only not have that expertise, but to be willing to try and ask questions. The classroom is actually a really emotional space, and I think we forget that. And presenting my experiences in China, it really helped my students to re-see a lot of the conflicts or a lot of these kind of these issues that are presented in a really static way and also are outside of that kind of cultural mainstream. So especially looking at things like our border politics here, there's usually this one narrative that students are exposed to constantly, and giving them a way to re-see that and kind of denaturalize it and look at it again and see how they actually have very similar to experiences to folks in China. That was really an important and impactful moment for them. And so, my thesis, if you will, is when you're globalizing your curriculum, it doesn't mean that you have to go and draw out factoids from these other cultures, but it means that you want to bring in the culture that's already present in a classroom and see how you can validate that and empower that and use that to expand for your students. Thank you.